We understand that we live in a culture where there are all different kinds of competing religions and people who are secular and who have no time for religion at all. And they couldn't be less interested in the whole idea of covenant. And people say to me, well, are these people in God's covenant? And I said, well, the question is first, are these people people? And if we answer that question, yes, of course, these people are people. And then the next question is, well, when God made his covenant in creation, was it with a view to everybody in the world? Or just with two isolated individuals that lived in a pretty garden in Eden? Now, the biblical idea is that the covenant that God made with Adam and Eve was a covenant with all of the human race. Now, people can deny that covenant. People can repudiate that covenant. People can despise that covenant. But what they can't do is get rid of it. They can't annul it. And one of the reasons why the Scriptures brings all of us before the judgment seat of God and pronounces us guilty before God is that all of us have broken his law. All of us have done bad works. All of us have failed to keep the original covenant of creation. All of us have failed to perform what every creature's duty is to perform, to glorify God, to honor him as God, to be grateful to him, and to obey his law. So the bottom line is that the whole world is populated by covenant breakers. Christ is sent into a world that is already guilty before the Father for breaking the Father's law, for violating the very terms of human existence, the very basis for human life as we were created before God. And so that's what is meant when we talk about the covenant of works. Now, it is because the first Adam failed in the covenant of works, and God would have had every moral right on that occasion to do exactly what the terms of the covenant promised. He could have destroyed them and the whole race, and that would have been it. But instead, he condescended to cover their nakedness and to promise them redemption through one who would act as their Savior. And so that God then at that point institutes the covenant of grace, which is given to Abraham, which is given to Moses, which is given throughout the Old Testament, the promise that God would redeem his people who were guilty according to the covenant of works, that he would save his people through another way. Now that's a critical thing, because there are professing Christians today who believe that there is a fundamental difference between how God saved people in the Old Testament and how people are saved now or after the New Testament. That, despite Paul's laboring the point in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th chapters of Romans, using Abraham as his illustration, that salvation was accomplished in the Old Testament by grace, just as it is in the New Testament, and that Abraham was justified not by the works of the law, but by faith in the promised Messiah. The difference is the difference between promise and fulfillment. The people in the Old Testament looked to the future promised Redeemer, put their trust in him, and they were justified by faith in him. We look backward to the work that has been accomplished by the Savior. We put our trust in him, and salvation is basically the same now as it was then. What's different is we have a much deeper understanding of the particulars and the details of it, and what is even more different is that it is a fait accompli, that the work of Christ has been already performed on the plane of history. But once a person breaks the covenant of works, The only way he can possibly be restored to fellowship with God is by God's mercy, not by his justice, by his grace, not by our works. And this is crucial because we live in a day where people still entertain the idea that they can be saved in the presence of God by their own works, that they can still merit their way into the kingdom. We don't really believe that we are debtors who can't pay our debts. We forget that the terms of the covenant of works were pretty stiff. They demand perfection. And if you sin once, there's nothing you can do to make up for that. Because once that blemish comes next to your name, what do you have to do to become perfect again? You can't become perfect again, because perfection doesn't allow for the slightest blemish. But of course, when we come before God, we come with a lot more than a slight blemish. We come with a radical kind of pollution before him. And so this distinction between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace is really designed to shed clear light on the nature of the gospel. Now I'm going to say something that's probably going to confuse everybody. We've been talking about the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and it's only by grace that we're saved, and so on. Now I'm going to say something maybe you're going to choke on. In the final analysis, the only way any person is ever justified before God is by works. We are saved by works, and we are saved by works alone. Don't touch that dowel. Let me explain this, please. When I say the only way we're saved by works is this, that the covenant of grace must be distinguished from the covenant of works, but never separated from it. The covenant of grace is God's covenant that he institutes to ensure that the original covenant is finally kept. And when I say we're justified by works and by works alone, what do I mean by it? I mean that the grounds of my justification and the grounds of your justification are the perfect works of Jesus Christ. We're saved by works, but they're not our own. That's why we say we're saved by faith and we're saved by grace, because the works that save us aren't our works. They're somebody else's work, who submitted himself at every point to the covenant of works. The New Testament describes Jesus as the new Adam. He is the new humanity who accomplishes what Adam failed to accomplish. By one man's disobedience, the world is plunged into ruin, and by the other man's obedience to the law of God in all of its demands and in perfect conformity, Christ redeems his people by winning the blessings promised that God had promised to his original creatures in their behalf. Now, I'm saved by grace insofar as the work that saves me is not my own. I'm saved by works in the sense that the basis of my salvation is on the works of the perfect worker, the one who, from all eternity, was willing to assume the burden of God's creatures and was willing to come to this world to submit himself to the terms of the original covenant of works and to fulfill it by his perfect obedience, and that God gives to his people all of the benefits of that work, so that he gives to us all that Christ has earned, and all that he is becomes ours when we place our trust in him. That's what we mean by the covenant of grace. It's not like the covenant of works is the Old Testament and the covenant of grace is the New Testament. No, the covenant of grace is working ever since the 3rd chapter of Genesis. It's all through the Old Testament and into the New, because it is based upon God's free grace to needy sinners.